to start, my co-founder Kivanç and I, myself, Thomas, would like to share some observations from working with over 3,000 customers all across Europe. Between the two of us, we've now talked to over 1,000 privacy, information security and compliance leaders over the last decade, and we'll hopefully channel some of their insight, share some data points, and maybe an anecdote here or there. And I think we have one meme which will hopefully make you smile, but other than that, we'll keep it professional. So let's get started. We'll kick it off with the first out of 4 forces that we would like to address today, which is a raised bar, a new regulatory age, and lots of new regulatory frameworks. I think some of these names, some of these circles here, they need no introduction in this group. GDPR has obviously been around since 2016/2018. It's really leveled the playing field for organizations in the EU and beyond. In a way, it's something that certainly, I guess, we as Europeans can be proud of. With all its faults and all its controversy, it's certainly created a level playing field and become a global role model for other legislation, such as CCPA in California, Brazilian legislation, LGPD. And ultimately, that took over many, many principles, such as data subject rights, that we've been holding dear for a very long time on the old continent. And ultimately, due to the risk of regulatory scrutiny, the fines, which was obviously a big ghost of the past back then, it created lots of confusion, but it ultimately, and that probably was a positive outcome, it made security and compliance a board-level topic, and it made it a topic where there was a lot more C-level attention than in years before. And we believe that NIS2 will have a similar effect, and Kivanç will dive into that a little bit, obviously coming into effect in October 2024, so very much imminent in a little more than a year. And in tandem with the Cyber Resilience Act, we believe that will also, in a way, level the playing field and set a ground for a common level of cybersecurity at least in critical infrastructure, but ideally also beyond. We think one important component and also difference to GDPR is that obviously with GDPR, there was some potential personal liability implications for executive management, but ultimately that was mainly restricted to gross negligence, et cetera, right? And we think that, and back then or until nowadays, it's sort of enough as an executive to just appoint your CISO, appoint your chief risk manager, and oversee that, but ultimately delegate a lot of tasks and responsibilities. And we think that with NIS2, given that exec management must sign off on and really monitor cyber risk management, that's quite a change. So it's harder to delegate the decision-making to a third party, and ultimately there is a personal liability, including even a potential criminal liability for breaches of duty. And we believe that's quite a fundamental shift in how important people will perceive this as a piece of regulation. Of course, there are many, many more frameworks. I mean, ISO 27001, the 2022 version, is in and has been in since October 22. And then obviously TISAX version 6 is currently under construction and in draft form. So I think the takeaway here is, and you see many, many more dots around it, we'll only touch on a couple in this session, but certainly businesses are faced and organizations are faced with a changing regulatory landscape.
Thank you, Thomas. Let's bring some light to NIS2, which I think right now we get a lot of questions. And one of the biggest experts in the market is Professor Kipka, who sees the regulation as one of the most complex security frameworks ever. And he asks everyone to start immediately, because there's a lot of things to change. And let's start perhaps with the first one, why so complex? One big driver is that the scope is really big. So it's not only critical infrastructure, as it used to be, but now also other industries which are seen also as essential and really important. So that could be energy, but also transport, health, food, and IT infrastructure. So it means that a manufacturing company doing something around food has to be NIS2 compliant. It is an IT company that does a lot of system integration also there. And that is only the direct companies, so direct influence. And if we add up the numbers, it's 28 to 30,000 companies alone in Germany. It's 180,000 companies in Europe. And on top of that, and I think that's even the bigger number, and I think even more relevant for all of you, is that roughly 10 times 1.6 million companies in Europe are going to be affected indirectly. Why? Because of the supply chain. Because all those big, essential and important companies have to make sure that their whole supply system, so the marketing agency working for them, the IT provider working for them, are also NIS2 compliant. And I think that is also going to change a lot, and that's what we see already, that the vendor and the pressure is going to higher. And it is not that easy to say if one's company is affected. So if you have questions, come to the panel afterwards in the InfoSec. We're going to discuss more in detail, or ask the DataGuard expert. But it's something that the applicability of this, and I think that's perhaps what you could say, is broader than one can think initially, and is really something that's going to come in October next year. And it feels a bit like GDPR. When we started the company, everyone said, oh, GDPR is in months and ages. And then one day before, people called us and said, hey, can you make a GDPR compliant? And we feel a second wave coming now with NIS2, with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of education, and like basic questions first. Is it applicable for a company? But then afterwards also on implementation. And that brings us to the second point of the complexity. And in the beginning of the year, we had a webinar with the author of NIS2, Marnix Decker, from the European Union, or like an institute or agency of the European Union. And it was interesting to say that his key advice to all the participants was start with a certified information management security system, such as an ISO, because he said that's the foundation and that's the base for everything that comes on top on NIS2. And roughly it's 70 to 80% of the scope. Yeah, so what we see on the market is like the people have never done an ISMS now say, okay, let's start with ISMS, perhaps even get certified, and then we can build on the additions. What are the key additions that we would like to highlight is one, early reporting. If you thought that in GDPR reporting an incident, a breach in 72 hours was complex, which is, now you only have 1 day with NIS2. So I think it's with 24 hours for reporting case as is a reporting NIS2, and that increases the pressure, how your organization has to work, how your tooling has to be, and how you are prepared to this. The second one is about risk management. And I think all of us have been talking about risk management, be it in privacy and InfoSec. But we've treated this typically as a one-off, okay, we do something, are the things that were effective? We never thought about this. We only thought, are there the right things to do? And then perhaps we did it once. We did once a pen testing. We did once a documentation. We did once a training. But now you have to monitor continuously all the things that you do are effective. And I think it's good, because that's really what forces all of us to make our companies secure, and not only making a check-the-box paperwork, which a couple of companies at least did. And the third one, and perhaps, sorry, the costs. What the authorities estimate is that the one-off investment for all the companies in Germany are more than $1 billion. And then annually also you have to keep investing for protecting your company. And that is also the main idea behind NIS2. It was done to really protect Europe against attacks from all kinds of areas. And the third one, I touched on it already, supply chain is really, really important. And rightfully so, because if you see the numbers, where the numbers increase in cyber attacks, is typically more and more also via the vendors. So they go via the agencies to your companies. They go via the HR tool that you perhaps have and use the leg there. So there are also more angles how cyber criminals are attacking you. And that's why the supply chain is also now important. Net, quite applicable. And yeah, you should start doing something now. ISMS is a good starting point, but additional complexity coming.
Thank you, Kivanç. And the second force we'd like to touch on is technology. Data. I think the amount of data processing is only going one way. Again, no one in this room needs to be educated about that. I think what's interesting is that epic battle, if you want to call it, or maybe to put it more mildly, the soft back and forth between data intelligence and data governance that we've seen over the last years. Organizations are obviously still striving to analyze and ultimately also to monetize personal data. As a reminder, that's our data. And this is manifested in this kind of ongoing back and forth. And as usual, the regulator has to play catch up. So we've had quite a few regulators as guests here. And it's always interesting that per usual, technology runs ahead and regulation tries to catch up. That's true for the Data Act as well. It's in its final stages, with obviously the main purpose of creating one single market for used/unused data, which enables data to be shared across the EU and across all sectors. And that's really to the benefit of research, that's to the benefit of public administrators, that's to the benefit of businesses. So we do think it's a useful piece of legislation to be created. And then, of course, there is AI. And you know, unlike NFTs, this is not kind of the next startup buzzword, right? Unlike the metaverse, it's very much not a bet on the future, but a reality that's shaping our world today. AI is a true platform shift. And obviously the optimists, the technology optimists, say the Reid Hoffmans and the Silicon Valley bunch, they call AI, or Reid Hoffman called AI, a steam engine of the mind, a cognitive GPS, and a tool for orientation, discovery, and navigation, and kind of, you know, likened it to the tools that we used to build the cathedrals of Florence. Now, a lot of others would be a lot more skeptical and less romantic about it, right? And point out the potential downsides. And that's not all out doomsday, but it is really the perils that come from the usage of, or the widespread usage of AI across businesses, organizations, and the general public. And certainly there are the calls for regulation that come with that skepticism, right? Or with that need to put guardrails. So the upcoming AI Act is already controversial. Proponents argue it'll provide us with a necessary and a truly helpful common level of risk-based regulation of different AI systems. And opponents obviously argue that AI is in our hands and that we should speed it up rather than slow it down with European regulation, and that Europe is already far behind on AI due to our red tape. So I think very similar discussions that we've had around the introduction of GDPR and so forth. I think from a practitioner's perspective, or maybe from a very personal perspective of being desperate before a wedding, having to write a best man speech, right? We all know that ChatGPT and the thousands of other AI tools can come in quite handy. But as you can imagine, from the 3,000 customers, from very small to very large, you can see how it's proliferating, and a lot of people do not know how to deal with it and kind of how to regulate it in their own entities. And lastly, there's cyber. Cyber threats are certainly growing, and they come in all shapes and sizes, sometimes AI-enabled, right? So obviously phishing attacks, social engineering, much easier with the use of AI. To give you an example, a script for crafting viruses via ChatGPT now includes prompts that you can find on common developer platforms, right, such as GitHub. And that in combination makes it a lot more powerful than what attackers had at their disposal, 1.5, 2 years ago. So ultimately, we all know these kind of, what is the cost of ransomware? How many malware attacks are there per day? That's really all just kind of going one way. But we think that an interesting kind of different perspective on this is that obviously AI can very much be used as a tool for cyber resilience as well, right? And improve overall security. Ultimately, there is even a potential to use it for capturing upside and for capturing revenue. As an example, from our customer base, one thing we've seen, especially our mid-market customers, take a long time to fill out security questionnaires from their enterprise customers. And so if you participate in tenders and RFP, the norm is that you spend many hours, sometimes days and weeks, to fill out these questionnaires. And we help there with a privately hosted model, a large language model that ultimately as a technology, reads through a lot of the documents and data, identifies what can be filled into the questionnaires, and ultimately summarizes while citing the origins as well, which is very important, right? So it's not a kind of random machine run wild on data that's pulled off the internet, but it's ring-fenced data from the organization running in a safe environment, right? And so ultimately, that for us is an example of, yes, AI can be used for defense, for cyber defense, but ultimately in an ideal case, organizations can also use it to capture upside and succeed in security and compliance rather than just kind of avoid failure.
Let's continue with the demand side. So your guys' companies. So what do you see there? I think we touched on it, but to visualize it a bit differently is we see a lot of pressure on the companies. So the pressure comes typically from regulations and regulators. Also comes from customers. So your guys' customers, be it B2B or B2C, ask more and more for privacy, InfoSec, and compliance. Sometimes for fast-growing tech companies, the investors that say, okay, we do a funding round, but only if you prove an increase in your level. And we touch on also on the cyber threats. And there, if you take then the departments or functions, depending on the size, typically privacy legal would take care of GDPR, compliance, whistleblowing now, thinking about Supply Chain Act. The IT departments were working at NIS2, hopefully, and ISO, perhaps finish in the car manufacturing area, TSAX. But you see more and more bubbles coming on, the regulation we touched on, and that is definitely a big, big pressure. And we see also limits on that single departments can't really handle this because there's too much knowledge. And it's also for really experienced compliance and security experts on our end to having overview and knowing how exactly it's going to be implemented in the companies is really almost impossible. Yeah? So that increases the pressure. And if you take like a company like Volkswagen, they have, I think there the example is quite interesting, where on the one hand side, they have to secure the factories now with this tool. So that's one end they have to work, all the people. Then they have going to receive millions of requests because all the data is saved in the cars and secured with the Data Act. They're thinking, how the hell are we solving this at scale? That we can cater with the answers of millions of people. And then they're using Gen AI for all the things that we know. Yeah? If self-driving car, question mark perhaps on Volkswagen, but the other areas of Gen AI is something they're really using, and they have to handle Gen AI Act, the AI Act in general. And there, the solution that they do is they're merging those functions and departments. And I think it's exactly the right thing to do. I think other organizations, good organizations, don't take it to say, hey, even in privacy, you have to take InfoSec serious. And there's a legal side, there's a technical side, there's a process side. And I think that driver is now increased, and departments get merged in more and more mature companies. Be it like the Volkswagens of this world, but also in our customer base, we see the more mature, the more broader the topics are seen and not that isolated anymore. Because that is the first step in our eyes. Aligning all those departments, aligning and seeing all those frameworks together and not isolated. But it's not enough. What customers need or companies need are an aligned management system. So departments working together is great. But having a unified privacy, InfoSec, and compliance management system is the future, where aligning those things together, not making a risk management for privacy, then one for InfoSec and one for compliance, having a privacy, InfoSec, and compliance risk management for everything that happens, because typically 80–90% of the risks are the same, different views, different solutions. But I think it's really important to have this holistically, and that's why having a holistic management system. For the privacy folks here, I think it's really cool to see, and that is a level up. In 2018, the DPO function was seen as a necessary evil a lot of times. Check the box, let's do it fast, let's give it someone on top. And I think a lot of people are nodding. And now we see the role getting more and more strategic, broader. You will now have other areas. You're now also more and more involved in the upside of the things. So not only risk mitigation, but also perhaps growth or more revenue or innovation in the AI factor. So should be the takeaway.
Looking at time, so I will try and speed it up a little bit to make sure we stick to schedule. To make good and to make true what Kivanç just said, there's talent needed. So there's people needed who like us, are enthusiastic about the space, who would like to work in the space, build a career in the space. And this is on privacy, just because we were lacking statistics on InfoSec, but 94% of European companies state they're experiencing a privacy skills gap. Unsurprising. So the same thing came out, or a very similar trend came out in a survey by the cybersecurity workforce, on cybersecurity workforce gap, which identified more than 3 million open positions and positions that will be very hard to fill with the existing talent pool. And as we know, especially mid-level and senior-level cybersec and information security experts, you can't make them overnight, right? We can't just turn university graduates into specialists. So you can see here some of the numbers. In the US, 400,000. In Germany, more than 100,000 positions that are likely to be unfilled, or at least partly unfilled. And what does that do? It leads to a massive need to automate. And I think over the last, another CISO study I recently read, I think states that 80% or 82% of CISOs resort to more automation and introducing more tools into their stack to make sure they get a hold of compliance and security. And that's fine, but I think what it has led to, and I'll cite a customer that I was speaking to the other day. She's the CISO of a global organization, has been a CISO for 20 years. She's very, very experienced in the field. But the buying and the kind of the pressure over the last 5 years has led to a complete and utter patchwork of vendors and internal resources trying to work together. Crying might be true, crying to work together, but really also trying to work together. She has PwC working on a NIS2 readiness assessment. She is working with an external law firm to work on all the DPIAs. She does have a whistleblowing tool from a software vendor, but has a different tool for data subject request handling from another vendor, right? That plus the internal resources and departments across different geographies trying to work together, that leads to a pretty complex patchwork that is hard, as Kivanç said, to keep kind of, not even under control, but at least to keep in sight. And I think that's something that we have really seen from the levels of sophistication and maturity in the market of people saying, I have nothing in this space, I'm trying to train some people and make progress, to, wow, I might have gone overboard a little bit, I now have 6, 7 different people or teams even working on this, plus I've bought 5 to 10 software solutions in this space. So now with more pressure to adjust the cost base and more CFO scrutiny, obviously companies are trying to kind of right-size that and get it right again, but we don't think it should just be a matter of cutting. We think it should be a matter of making it a more effective function. So to take away, we think the built-in and not bolt-on in the headline is quite spot on, because we do see it having been bolt onto a lot of customer organizations in the last years. I think we did touch on tick the box exercise versus really operationalizing compliance and security, and that I think is a mindset shift. DataGuard, usually we classify the customers into 3 maturity levels, and you see at the top maturity level, there's certainly already that notion of, yes, we're 100% aware that this is not a tick the box compliance exercise, but it's about making the organization more secure. But I think it's a process, and we're still moving towards it. The second is, I think Kivanç just elaborated on it for quite a bit, so I will skip that, but it's the interwoven compliance function. We touched on Volkswagen. Porsche is now merging even departments such as ethics, AI into the function to have a truly kind of holistic view of governance and risk. And lastly, it's really providing, and that's to us as people serving you in this space, we need to build a broader solution and make sure that we have answers for lots of questions and move away from point solutions that one is providing, and also moving away from kind of lobbing external advice into the customer organization. So just kind of standing on the outside as, say, an external DPO and just lobbing good advice into the org, and that we believe will really move into being fully integrated and really, really knowing customers' processes, having lots of data points that you're jointly looking at, and being more KPI driven also in that. And with these opening remarks, I will hand over to Bettina, who will shed light on what awaits us for the rest of the day. We hope this was insightful and somewhat entertaining, and yeah, wish you all the best for this day. Thank you.